Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Constitution Center. It is wonderful to see such an engaged and large audience of lifelong learners here at noon to educate ourselves about this crucial tension in America and around the world today between populism and constitutionalism. The National Constitution Center has started an exciting national commission, a 3-year initiative. A Madisonian Constitution for all. What would James Madison make of our current Congress, presidency, courts, and media? And how can we resurrect Madisonian values of thoughtful deliberation today? This panel, where we've assembled America's leading experts on populism, is a contribution to that effort, and I cannot wait to introduce you to the panelists in just a moment. We have a series of I'm so sorry, I've forgotten to recite our congressional mantra. And I know our guests who are listening backstage will be so impressed when I ask you, without prompting, to remember that we are here at this precious place, the National Constitution Center, which is the only institution in America, chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the US Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Beautiful. Thank you so much. I just learned this morning, you know how much Louis Brandeis is my hero, and he was called Isaiah. FDR called him Old Isaiah, and it was because he quoted the famous passage from Isaiah, "Come, let us reason together." Isn't that beautiful? And I think that's what we're doing here right now. We're coming to reason together. That's what the Constitution Center is about. And that's really what we're examining today, is the power of public reason under threat from new populist forces in America and around the world that are challenging the founders' vision of reasoned deliberation. You know about all the great programs that are coming up. You see behind you, they're just cycling. Bob Schieffer on October 17th, Khizr Khan on October 25th, Ed Ayers, the great Civil War historian, on October 30th, November 6th, Cass Sunstein about impeachment on a nonpartisan basis. And of course, the Liberty Medal to Senator McCain by Vice President Biden, our chair, on October 16th. It is now my great pleasure to introduce these 3 extraordinary scholars of populism and good friends. Mark Gitenstein is president of the Biden Foundation and practices law in DC. So I had the honor of meeting Mark in 1986. When I was an intern in college and came to, they're coming on quietly behind me. Rather than waiting, yes, please sit, and then let's everyone sit. This is like a living room. Yeah, Ed is here. I'm here, Mark.
Where am I?
Right here. This is wonderful. This is the sort of waiting for Godot version of the introduction, instead of, yes, all the way, instead of P.T. Barnum. But now I can look at them as I introduce them, like old friends, which all of us are. So Mark is in the middle, and we met in 1986 when I'm an intern in college, and he's chief counsel to the Judiciary Committee under the then chair, Joe Biden. And Vice President Biden, and with the help of Mark, presided over the Bork hearings. And it was that experience that kindled my passion for the Constitution. What an incredible honor to be a fly on the wall during that scene. And Mark went on to have an incredibly distinguished career as chief counsel to the Judiciary Committee, as counsel to Senator Biden, and most recently as US ambassador to Romania from 2009 to 2012, where he got to experience the hazards of populism up close. Ed Luce, another old friend from Washington, D.C., is Washington columnist and commentator for the Financial Times. He's worked for the Times since 1985. 1995, as of course you're much too young to. I was an intern in college then, and you were, yes. Philippine correspondent, capital markets editor, Washington bureau chief. He's been a speechwriter for the Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration, and has written this really superb new book, The Retreat of Western Liberalism. And finally, Jan-Werner Müller is professor of politics at Princeton. He's been a fellow at All Souls College and many other distinguished institutions. He is the author of several books, including this definitive book, which I've just had the extraordinary privilege of reading, What is Populism? Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mark Gitenstein, Ed Luce, and Jan-Werner Müller. All right, Mark, you recently wrote a piece where you quoted the speech that George F. Will gave at the launching of the Madisonian Constitution for All Commission. You quoted Will as saying that the founders were opposed to direct democracy, that they feared demagogues and the mob, and they constructed a system of filtered representation and constitutional republicanism to prevent populist forces from threatening liberty. And you invoked two experiences. You had George Wallace in the South when you were growing up, and your experiences in Romania. Can you compare and contrast Wallace and Romania as expressions of the kind of populism the founders feared?
Well, I was ambassador to Romania from 2009 to 2012, and the highest priority I had in terms of directions from President Obama and Vice President Biden and Secretary Clinton was to deal with the issue of anti-corruption and the rule of law. And Romania has made incredible progress and had during my period. In 2012, the summer of 2012, there was an election and the center-right pro-reform government was overthrown. And the center-left immediately set about to try and dismantle that process. And their basic argument was that we have a majority and we can do anything we want. And my answer to them was, you know, look, I grew up in Alabama. A lynch mob is a majority. It doesn't mean it's right. And I cited my experience as a young teenager in Alabama watching what happened in Selma and in Birmingham. I actually went to high school in Birmingham and saw the riots there. And but for the intervention of the federal government with President Kennedy and the federal courts with the famous Judge Frank Johnson, you know, George Wallace would have run over everybody's civil liberties and civil rights in that state. And that was what was beginning to happen in Romania. And my argument was you need to listen to the US, but more importantly, you need to listen to the EU and the IMF and the other multilateral organizations that you have joined arms with. You made a commitment to comply with these basic rules, and you have to comply with them. It was not a very popular position to take, but I saw direct parallels between the two. And I don't know if my Alabama argument made much difference to them. But the thing to remember about Romania, it is the most pro-American country in all of Europe, so that when we spoke up, they did listen. And fortunately, they did the right thing in the summer of 12.
It's a powerful analogy.
Yeah.
Jan, in this remarkably rich, condensed book, at the end you have 7 theses on populism, and I'm going to quickly put them on the table just because they're so powerful. Populism is neither the authentic part of modern democratic politics nor a kind of pathology caused by irrational citizens. It's a permanent shadow of representative politics. Second, not everyone who criticizes elites is a populist. Populists are anti-pluralist. Third, what matters for populists is that they symbolically represent the real people from which the correct policy is then deduced. Fourth, populism is not a path to more participation in politics. Fifth, populists can write constitutions. This was one of the most surprising parts of your book, and that there will be partisan or exclusive constitutions designed to keep populists in power in the name of perpetuating some supposed original and authentic popular will. 6, populists are a real danger to democracy, not just to liberalism, but they should be engaged. And 7th, populism is not a corrective to liberal democracy, but it can be useful in making clear that parts of the population really are represented. There's so much in there that's rich, but since it's the Constitution Center, let me begin with the constitutional point. How is it possible, given the fact that Madison seemed to suggest a tension between populism and constitutionalism, that we could have a populist constitution? And what does a populist constitution look like?
So you were kind enough to read out these bullet points at the end, but if I may, let me first of all underline one specific point. So of course, part of our problem today is that we are witnessing an absolutely inflationary use of the word populism. All kinds of actors, left, right, even center, are called populists. Even poor Emmanuel Macron, during the French presidential election, was accused of being a populist, namely a populist of the extreme center. Whatever the hell that means. So my contribution to hopefully clearing up this mess a little bit is to say that contrary to the conventional wisdom today, not everybody who criticizes as the cliched phrase goes, elites, is automatically a dangerous populist. In a sense, it's a very strange thought when you think about it, because any old civics textbook would have told you it's a good thing to keep an eye on the powerful. All of a sudden, beginning of the 21st century, we're told, no, don't do that, because that makes you a dangerous populist. So, of course, when in opposition, populists criticize governments. But above all, I believe they will, in one way or another, say that they and only they represent the people, or what they often call the real people, or also very typically, the silent majority. So long story short, what matters about populism, in my view, is not anti-elitism. What matters is anti-pluralism. If, for instance, Turkish President Erdogan says about himself and his party, we are the people, and then turning to his critics, who are you? That, I think, is the kind of language that tells us that something dangerous, anti-pluralist, and I would say ultimately anti-democratic is going on. Or if somebody says, let's say at an inauguration speech, today power is given back to the people. Of course, it means only if I rule, do the people rule. And Chavez, by the way, said the same thing. So, long story short, it's possible for these kinds of actors to say, we, as the unique representatives of the people, are also going to fashion a constitution that works for the people. And actors like Viktor Orban in Hungary have done that. And it's not entirely a sham constitution in the way that, let's say, Joseph Stalin's constitution in the 30s was just a complete sham. I mean, nothing in it was true. Some of these constitutions do establish real limits on power, but they also very cleverly put in mechanisms and provisions to basically ensure that the supposedly unique representatives of the people stay in power as long as possible. If I may add one last point, I think we always have this nice thought that as democracies, we screw up all the time. But we are the only system that can self-correct. And the authoritarians are all going to end like the Soviet Union in 1991 because they can't admit mistakes, they can't correct mistakes, and so on. And I think what we have to, alas, realize is that these kinds of actors are also learning all the time. And they figured out a way, in many cases, to actually have constitutions that look, in many parts, pretty good. So they want to be legalistic in a certain way. They don't do obvious, massive human rights violations because they realize, oh, then a sort of memory from the 20th century is going to kick in that, this must be a dictatorship. They've become much more subtle and sophisticated in all kinds of ways. And they've also learned really how to kind of fool international observers. They know how Freedom House works. They know how the European Commission works. They know that they all come with their checklists. And they will do enough to make what they do plausible. They will try to sow a lot of confusion. They are actually very good at comparing. So they say, oh, why are you criticizing us for not having a constitutional court anymore? Look, the UK doesn't have one either. So we need to kind of, I think, realize that these actors have become much smarter, much more subtle, much more sophisticated, which is not to say that they will triumph in the long run, but we have to up our game in a certain way.
Ed, based on what you've heard so far, how would you define populism and how would you define constitutionalism? And then tell us why it's on the rise. You give lots of powerful economic reasons in the US and around the world. Just to narrow the focus, what is populism, what is constitutionalism, and why has it been on the rise in the US in recent years?
So that's a lot of complex questions. Yeah. Well, I might sort of be selective about which ones I answer. I mean, just to reinforce Jan's point, there are 25 fewer democracies around the world today than there were in 2000. And most of those are qualitative judgments. Is Hungary any longer a democracy? Is Turkey any longer a democracy? Russia clearly isn't any longer a democracy. But almost all of them have done it not through coups or military takeovers, but through shifting the terms and the furniture, more like the populist constitution tactics that you've just been outlining. So why is populism on the rise across the West? Look, there's been a very divisive debate about whether it's because of economic anxiety or whether it's because of what pollsters like Gallup euphemistically call cultural anxiety, namely racism, misogyny, homophobia, etc. And I think it's a false distinction. I don't see why it should be one or the other. They're clearly braided. They clearly interact on each other. And it's clearly, there are no, in moral terms, extenuating economic circumstances that could possibly justify racist or scapegoating of immigrants or misogyny or any of those kinds of prejudices. But that is a moral point, which admits of no qualification. The analytic picture is quite different, and it tells us something different, which is when you've got the middle of the middle, across the West, to varying degrees, shrinking, bifurcating, fragmenting, then you have what the late Barrington Moore, the American scholar, said: no bourgeoisie, no democracy. If there is a polarization in the economy, you will see a polarization in politics. And whether you look at Germany, Austria, or the United States, the establishment parties of center-left, center-right have dominated politics for decades. In Germany, SPD and the CDU between them would get about 85-90% of the vote. That's now down to 52% of the vote. If you add up all the primary votes last year that went to Bernie Sanders and that went to Donald Trump, and translated that into seats in Congress, they would have a majority. They wouldn't obviously be working together, but the populists would have a majority. So I think that the answer to your question is a very complex one. I will add one extra point. Two of the countries I've been based in, Philippines for the Financial Times, the Philippines and India. These two countries are seeing rising middle class standards of living. People who are surveyed say their children will be better off than they are. So clearly there is a very different picture. The middle is actually getting bigger, and yet they too are increasingly subjected to the populist sort of authoritarian leanings that we see and feel in the West. So there is something else in this equation, and I think that's technology and the impact of technology on politics. Mm-hmm. And I think what technology does is it makes campaigning a lot easier, micro-targeting, psychographic profiling, having mixed and diverse messages to different groups. It makes the task of being a political consultant on a campaign more and more sophisticated and more, in a way, more and more easy. In contrast, technology makes governing more and more difficult. More and more tough to satisfy expectations. There's an impulsivity about electoral expectations that is just unmeetable, that technology has a sort of accelerating effect on. And I think that gap between governing and campaigning and the role of technology is a huge underexplored factor here.
So this question of what is populism and why is it on the rise is important and complex enough that we need another beat on it. Mark, I've heard so far Jan say that populism is not just anti-elitism, but anti-pluralism, and it's not simple majoritarianism either, and Ed suggests that it rises from polarization. How would you define populism now in light of what you've heard, and why do you think that it's on the rise in America?
I think populism in the United States, at least, is anti-elitism driven by an underlying serious economic malaise. I think that Ed's book is very revealing. He does a very good job of explaining the data. I think the most significant data point in his book was that 30, 40 years ago, the United States was had the greatest class mobility of any country in the West. Now it has the last. If you want to know what has happened, is that these people, mainly white people without a college education, by the way, the largest voting bloc, he also points out, in the United States, are very unhappy, and for very good reason. And if we don't deal with that and they blame the elite for this. So in that sense, in the United States, that 1/3 that you always see supporting Trump, that's who they are. And they have very good reason to be unhappy. And the challenge for us progressives is, how can they listen to Trump, with his misogynism and his racism and still support him? Well, because they're angry and they're desperate. And, we progressives have not addressed them. And when we do address them, it's with 20-page elitist policy papers instead of their underlying malaise. And until we do that, nothing is going to change in this country. That's why populism is so powerful right now in that sense.
Jan, you say that populism is not the same as democracy. The major differences between democracy and populism are that one enables majorities to authorize representatives whose actions may or may not turn out to conform to what a majority of citizens expected or would have wished for. The other pretends that no action of a populist government can be questioned because the people have willed it so. So there's a notion of representation that distinguishes the liberal democracy from populism. Talk about the history of populism in the US, because you talk about it in the book, and you say that the Grangers during the Progressive era wanted free silver and financial reform, and the Jacksonians attacked the bank, and so forth. Is the populism we're seeing now, but all of those were framed in constitutional terms, and those populists made their claims and rooted it in the Constitution. Is Trumpian populism different, and how does it relate to the populist movements we've seen before in the US?
So I end up with a very, to say the least, counterintuitive position on the basis of that book, because I end up saying that the People's Party in the late 19th century, where even the word populism was coined, actually wasn't populist. So it's a typical thing where I say, typical academics, they come up with these things which totally go against common sense, how can that possibly be the conclusion? But it's partly the conclusion because I don't see these actors as having made the claim, we and only we represent the people. Of course they were anti-elitist, of course they were anti-Wall Street, anti-railroad bosses, and so on. In fact, if you compare some of the rhetoric to Occupy Wall Street, you sometimes can't tell which is which. But the fact that Occupy said, we are the 99%, even though it sounds so populist, still makes a difference, because they didn't say, we are the 100%. And my claim is that the populist really ends up saying, we are the 100%. Remember Erdogan, we are the people, you are nothing. Or if I may give one quotation from the man who now occupies the White House, in a campaign speech in 2016 in May, he said, I'm quoting from memory, the most important thing is the unification of the people, because all the other people don't mean anything. That's not just anti-elitism. The populist is always in the business of excluding certain others. Obviously, the other contenders for power, who are immediately accused of being immoral, corrupt, and, to coin a phrase, crooked. So it's never just a policy disagreement. It's always immediately saying the others are bad characters, which is different from, I think, democratic actors who will fight, of course, about policies, values, and so on, but they don't make it moral and personal in quite the same way. And secondly, and less obviously, these populist actors will always say that some people just don't belong, even if they happen to have an American passport, even if they legally belong. So if I may just to maybe bring that last point, which is not so obvious in certain ways back home. Remember Nigel Farage, leader of the UK Independence Party, still during the night of Brexit, saying this had been a victory, as he put it, for real people. Implying, of course, that the 48% who wanted to stay inside the European Union, well, on one level, aren't quite real. If I may add one last thought, because we've already been talking about the mob and the people are to blame and so on. People may have very good reasons to be angry. Sometimes that anger links up with a populist project, but the populist project is driven by elite actors. This is not a spontaneous sort of thing coming from below. Some countries, I think we've seen a very clear pattern that basically when populists come to power, it's one elite replacing another, very often with sort of culture war style arguments. These are not the real people, now the real people are in power, but it's basically just another elite. So in Poland, for instance, people talk about Poland A and Poland B. What we're seeing right now is the triumph of Poland B. But it's not, ordinary people who've finally been put in the driver's seat. So, contrary to what is often said, populists don't have a problem with the idea, the principle of political representation. They just think that unless they're in power, we have the wrong, i.e. corrupt representatives. But once these actors get in power, they will govern on the basis of representation. They're not saying, let's now have many more possibilities for participation, online voting, open-ended deliberation in town halls. We don't see any of that in Hungary, Poland, the US, for that matter, Turkey. Nothing of that sort. So I think it's a mistake to think that somehow they are committed to really bringing people back in. No, it's a purely theoretical, in a sense, kind of rhetoric, and it's propounded ultimately by just a different set of elites.
And as I hear this really illuminating and complex discussion, I want to ask, is populism more of a European than an American philosophical tradition? You talk about its roots in Rousseau and the general will, but this notion that the politicians represent the real people, does that come from Europe and not the US, and is its appearance in the US a new phenomenon?
I don't think its appearance in the US is a new phenomenon. I do believe that, looking at it slightly differently, it's probably no accident that the two countries that have been worst afflicted by populism in the midst of all the sort of economic anxieties that we were talking about earlier are the United States and Britain. These are the two countries on either side of the Atlantic that have not experienced occupation, revolution, defeat in war in living memory and grandparental living memory. So I think there's an extraordinarily, particularly complacent elites in those two countries that did not see the warning signs of this coming. And so I think there is a sort of English-speaking world problem there. Some of you would read Andy Borowitz in The New Yorker, the comic sketch writer. He had the wonderful phrase, on the morning of June the 24th of 2016, when Brexit results were just, the dust was settling, and he said, Britons lose long-cherished right to look down on Americans as dumber than they are. Then, of course, America leveled the playing field on November the 8th. And I think there is tactically a real problem here with seeing people who are voting against the elites as stupid and dumb, and people who can't spell and who have no idea of what their true interests are. And when you mentioned Rousseau and the general will, there is a problem there with the liberal pushback against this abhorrent phenomenon of Trumpism, this horrible sort of situation we find ourselves in, that the liberals are the ones who also understand the true will. It's just a different general will they understand than the one Trump claims to be channeling and expressing. And I think there is a dangerous liberal tactical error there of talking about working class whites, blue collar whites, voting against their interests and not understanding their true interests, which, as conceived of by the liberal narrative, is your pocketbook interests. Now, we, as professors or journalists, might vote against our economic interests, but we can, because we're enlightened. We understand the sort of moral value, but they can't. They're just stupid. And I think that's tactically a very, very dumb way of approaching this problem.
It's why we lost the election.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you about that, Mark, because you worked with Vice President Biden for years, our new chair of the Constitution Center. What's the difference between the way Vice President Biden talked to those blue-collar workers that he knew so well in Scranton and that of Trump, and why did we lose the election? Why did the Democrats lose the election on a nonpartisan basis?
You know, first of all, in defense of Hillary Clinton, when she ran in 2008, she ran as the blue-collar candidate, which is so puzzling to why in 2016 she ran as the elitist candidate. I've always found that puzzling. I think the thing about Biden, and you and I both know Biden quite well, is he is actually a blue-collar guy. I mean, he grew up in a blue-collar, by the way, so did Hillary, pretty much. Grew up in a sort of a blue-collar kind of upbringing. So he intuitively understands what's like and tells these great stories about his father moving from Scranton to Wilmington and having to give up his job and not being able to provide a college education for his son. And when he speaks about these things, the average blue-collar worker, I think, says, this guy understands. And I think the problem that Hillary, and it may not be really Hillary's fault, but the sort of apparatus that was built around her and the strategy that was built around her, is it didn't send that message. it sent a very different message, which was, that's why the speeches to Goldman Sachs hurt so much. And calling these people deplorable was so damaging. So,
can I just add very quickly there to reinforce your point? I believe that Joe Biden's net assets are around $500,000 once you subtract the mortgage he still has in Wilmington. Not that much different to when he came to Washington in the early 1970s in real terms. Hillary Clinton's north of $100 million, which is a different universe. The monetizing the brand thing is a huge difference, and I know they both have family ties in Scranton, but I think that's where the similarities end, because the monetizing the brand of the Clintons is a valid, legitimate target for people to say, this is what's wrong with society today.
But you and I talked about this in the green room. Donald Trump is a billionaire. Okay?
Indeed.
And he lives in these elegant houses and buildings, et cetera. He's able to communicate to those people. Why? And I think we need to find out the answer to that. I think you and I have our theory. My theory always about Donald Trump was that he was actually discriminated against by the elites in New York. They never accepted him. So he intuitively gets the alienation that underlies these voters, and he's able to communicate with them in a very gut-level way. And I think, we need to be able to do that.
Jan, can I put on the table this crucial question of whether constitutions can constrain populism, and in particular, will the US Constitution save the US from populism? The framers did not believe in the concentration of power. They wanted to disperse it among the branches so that no particular branch could speak in the name of we the people and claim that they alone represent the people. Will the US Constitution save constitutionalism in the US?
I have 3 hours now to answer that
20
simple
words or
question.
less.
The fate of the republic depends
Let
on
me
you.
try to put 2 points on the table. So clearly, it would be wrong to pretend that the U.S. is just like Turkey or Hungary or some of the earlier examples we talked about. No, it's a very different system. There are reasons to believe that the checks are much stronger in all kinds of ways. Having said that, it's a question sort of what exactly it would mean for constitutionalism to be eroded. It's one thing to go for official change, a new constitution, amendments, constitutional convention. We're only a few states away from a potential convention. So that's one route, and that still seems relatively unlikely. It's another thing to basically dismantle the institutions without officially abolishing them. So if you basically make the State Department dysfunctional, or if the head of the EPA day and night meets with lobbyists, yes, these institutions are still there, but in a certain way they're not there anymore. So that's the more worrying scenario, I think. And that, again, is harder to figure out. It's one thing for an actor to say, now I will officially give you a new constitution. It's another thing to basically be working behind the scenes to some degree. The other thing that maybe is worth putting out as a thought is that to the extent that most of these actors we've been talking about officially remain constitutionalists, so they don't say, I'm going to govern in a completely unconstrained way on the basis of what the people assembled on a square tell me every day. No, they have law in place, constitutions in place, and they remain officially committed to democracy, rule of law, and so on. It's strange to me that one particular response that in the old days would have been the obvious response in a situation like this, we don't see much of, and that is civil disobedience. You would have said, look, when the regime remains committed to the same ideals, we're going to sort of appeal to the majority and other people to say, let's come out. Let's stand up for these principles. We're not that polarized. We actually all agree on democracy, freedom, and so on and so forth. And up until maybe the middle of the last decade, people are very confident that this tactic works. I mean, Milosevic in Serbia was still brought down by a relatively small number of people. Some of my colleagues in social science have done these big empirical studies and are now saying, if you can mobilize 3.5% of your population continuously, any regime will fall. Wow, 3.5% isn't that many. And yet we haven't seen any of this. So one maybe idea why we're not seeing it so much anymore is that, of course, civil disobedience or protest in general relies on the idea of publicity, of a shared public sphere, where other people are going to hear about injustices, about problems, and so on. We all love a particular Danish fairy tale. It takes just one child to say that the emperor has no clothes and everything changes. But of course the premise is that everybody can hear the child. And if you look at cases like Turkey, Hungary, where basically the regime has dismantled media pluralism, where people just don't hear about certain things, that game changes completely. And that would also worry me about the situation in this country. With highly segmented public spheres, people just getting completely different types of information, different topics are discussed in different contexts. We can't take for granted anymore that some of our sort of civics textbook wisdom about what we might really have to do if it gets really bad, whether that still applies anymore, like we would hope.
Let me just say one thing.
More than I wanted you to answer the same question because it's so important. And Jan is saying that the end of a common consensus about news may threaten the entire Madisonian project. And just to reinforce the significance of the question, Jack Goldsmith in The Atlantic said recently that the constitutional structures would survive, the courts are constraining the president, total constitutional norms wouldn't be threatened, but these extra constitutional norms, like new technologies segmenting the media universe, might pose a threat to common deliberation. So what's your answer to the question of whether
let me
the US
just say a word
Constitution
about civil disobedience. In the last year, you've had dramatic events in Romania and in Poland where people came into the streets and literally blocked an anti-constitutional, anti-rule of law, pro-corruption agenda. Literally stopped it. 500,000 people were on the streets of Romania. That's more people that were on the streets of Romania than the revolution occurred in 1989. And the same thing happened in Poland. That's why they reversed themselves. So it's still happening. Now that's, by the way, driven by middle class. Those were all middle class people working for, and technology made it happen. They did not do it through conventional media. It was all done through, I've looked into it. It was all done through Facebook and it was done online. So, technology is also a positive here. On your question about the Constitution, though, briefly, look, it's a test to our institutions, but it's almost as old as our republic. Don't you remember, it was Andrew Jackson who said, Justice Marshall has his opinion, let him go out and enforce it. No greater challenge to the rule of law than that. But in the end, what's happened in the United States, because of the way our institutions are built, we eventually accommodate legitimate beefs. And that's what has to happen here. These people have a legitimate economic argument and concern, and our system has to respond to it. If it does, our constitutional system will survive. If it doesn't, it won't. That's what I believe. Yeah.
Britain does not, of course, have a written constitution. Brexit could not have happened in the US because we don't allow constitutional change by snap votes, an initiative and referenda.
Neither did we.
Yes. So might the US Constitution save the US from populism, but might Britain be doomed?
So in Britain, at some stage in the next year, about a year from now probably, Prime Minister May is going to put whatever divorce agreement she's negotiated with the EU to the British Parliament, and they will have to pass it before the other 27 members can pass it to meet the 2-year divorce deadline. At that point, Labour will vote against it. They won't oppose Brexit, they will oppose a Tory Brexit. The Liberal Democrats will vote against it, the Scottish Nationalists will vote against it, and all you would need is 10 Conservative members of Parliament to vote against it. That's the majority, and then her government would fall, the deal would go, and then all possibilities would be open. The reason why I'm skeptical that those 10 Tory members of Parliament will do it, even though there's probably 50 or 60 who privately deeply oppose Brexit and see that it's a national catastrophe, is because the tabloids will rip their viscera out, parade it through the streets as enemies of the people, as traitors to the popular will. And so it takes a lot of courage. Now think of how many Republican senators we've got on Capitol Hill who will privately say to you, yeah, Trump's nuts. He is nuts. What are they doing about it? Not much. A couple are. I mean, Susan Collins, John McCain on certain votes, but most of them think he's nuts. I mean, not just nuts in a sort of colloquial way, nuts. Why aren't they doing anything? For the same reason, because Steve Bannon, Breitbart Embassy, will revoke their visas to being American citizens. They will charge them with being traitors to the cause of the true American will. There is intimidation. How does this map onto the conversation about your question about America's Constitution? Ultimately, I'm not too worried about the Madisonian system of checks and balances. I think the courts are and will do their job. I think the special prosecutor, Robert Müller, is doing his job. I think my profession is doing a way better job this year than it did last year. And some other aspects of civil society. What I'm worried about is the conditions, the brew that led to Trump is actually getting worse. I mean, Jan quite rightly mentioned that populists are elites. Well, Donald Trump's economic proposal, if this tax cut gets through, and it might not, and that is, that is the great saving grace about Trump, is he's incompetent. But if it does get through, we're going to get a further exacerbation of the conditions and the economic conditions of people out there, a further sense of frustration. And where that leads politically, I don't know, but I'm not really worried about the furniture, institutional furniture, and the checks and balances and the separation of powers. I'm worried about the sociology and the socioeconomics of America out there. I think it's getting worse under Trump, and I don't know where that will lead politically. Maybe to a competent version of Trump. That's my real concern.
A fascinating suggestion that the tax cut might have the inadvertent and perverse effect of exacerbating the economic inequality that led to Trump in the first place. Jan, now let's look to the world, and do you agree with Ed that it's economic conditions and not constitutionalism that either exacerbates populism or could save us from it? I ask the question broadly, in the broad
I know this is deeply unsatisfying, but there is no one-line answer. And in a sense, we always say, oh, these populists, they have these simplistic ideas, or they're demagogues. But, sometimes when they serve us with a simple explanation of what's happening, losers of globalization or something, we I think, are too ready to just buy it, because it makes our life easier too, if it were just one simple cause. But national contexts still matter a great deal. So in some countries, it clearly has little to do with economics. I mean, in the Netherlands, for instance, Geert Wilders still did pretty well. Netherlands is pretty well off. It clearly is much more about a kind of culture war or other kinds of anxieties. In some countries, it's about the fact that people have had enough of what they perceive of as technocracy, which is also, in a sense, a version of anti-pluralism. Only one correct rational solution, or only one reasonable center in the middle, which is, by the way, the Macron phenomenon, where he basically says, there's now the big reasonable center, and there are only sort of crazies on the left and the right. Might remind you of Tony Blair in the 90s, actually ended up exacerbating populism, but it wasn't directly about economics. So I think it's a very complicated picture. I know this is a very boring thing to say, but I think we just have to bear that in mind, and not to kind of think that, there's going to be some quick fix one way or the other. One thing I would underline, though, you're all familiar with this narrative which we heard up until March this year, that there was now an unstoppable global wave, or as Nigel Farage, for whom the wave was apparently too small an image, a tsunami of populism that was washing away the elites everywhere. Of course, first Brexit, then Trump, and so on. I think what this, of course, completely overlooked, with all due respect, is that Nigel Farage didn't bring Brexit about all by himself. He needed his very established conservative collaborators. Boris Johnson is a bit funny too, maybe, but someone like Michael Gove, the man who famously went on British TV and said, this country is tired of experts, after all the experts had said, don't do Brexit. Interestingly, Michael Gove himself was always seen as a kind of intellectual in the Tory party. So it wasn't just anybody on the street who told people, don't believe in experts. It took an expert to tell people that expertise is overrated. And in this country, at the risk of saying the blindingly obvious, Donald Trump did not become president as the candidate of a third, new, spontaneous, grassroots, working-class protest movement. He was the candidate of a very established party. He also needed people to vouch for him. Chris Christie, for instance, Rudy Giuliani, you all remember this. And the explanation of what happened on November 8th is that 90% of self-identified Republicans came out for Trump. Long story short, all I'm trying to say is that rather than having this image of, independent populist triumphs everywhere, what we have to realize is that in Western Europe and North America, no right-wing populist has won without the collaboration of conservative, established elites. And if we only always focus on populists and kind of exaggerate their power, we don't see that larger dynamic, Ed was in a sense already alluding to this, we don't hold them accountable for the choices they make about collaborating or not collaborating. Believe me.
Mark, there have been some defeats for populism recently, Macron and Merkel most notably, but we are seeing this wave around the world from Italy to the Netherlands, France, Rwanda, Turkey, as well as the UK and the US. Jan warns me not to be simplistic in trying to say that it's all the same, but how would you describe to the audience the threat of populism in each of these countries? What values does it threaten?
Well, it's not unlike what John said. The oligarchs, at least let's take Romania for example, they seize on whatever argument advances their agenda. And if it's a populist argument, like in Romania right now, the hot new thing is to do a referendum on gay marriage. It's right out of the right-wing playbook here in the United States. And the oligarchs are jumping on this. I think what they really want to do is tie that into constitutional change that'll do other reforms on rule of law or whatever, and to keep them in power. So it's different in every country. For example, in Romania, it's not the Russians that are driving this, or Russian propaganda or whatever. Romania will do it to itself because it's a command and control economy that's trying to become more democratic and free market. And the oligarchs don't like that, so they seize on it there. In Hungary, it's a totally different chemistry that's going on. I mean, you have a former, Orban was a former anti-communist dissident, basically, who's leading it, and it's a power play. The Russians are playing a role in that. I think the Russians are mischievous, and even in Romania, you can find them on the social networks, very active. And I think they play a role in all of these countries. They're less effective in countries like Poland and Romania because once they're surfaced, the average citizen doesn't like them. But the forces that are at work are not dissimilar. And I think there's a lot of economic forces at work as well. I think there's this dark underside of globalization that is driving a lot of this as well. I mean, these countries are suffering economically as well.
Ed, what do you think the threat is? You quote in your book Fareed Zakaria's famous notion of illiberal democracies, where Zakaria seems to suggest that these populist forces can threaten the rule of law, limited government, individual rights, and checks and balances. Is that the threat, or are there others?
I'd certainly agree with Jan and Mark's point. I mean, the liberal democracy is not some fixed state. It tends to move into illiberal autocracy. And you don't just rest where Orban is resting. He's busily rewriting the rules of the game. He controls the organs of the media. He basically controls the courts. He's now shutting down NGOs. You've got this horrible Soros, anti-Soros campaign. Soros sort of standing for the globalist elites, the Jewish globalist elites, sort of implied. And that you're moving to more and more illiberal democracy, and at some point it's not democracy. So it's a liberal non-democracy. And I think that's the fear. There is a dynamic there. I think that's certainly the direction Erdogan is taking Turkey. I think that there are former democracies all over the world that are somewhere in that state and on that journey. It's not, as I say, there's a sort of Tolstoyan element to this. Populism is on the rise around the world, but it's unique to each. We're each unhappy in our own particular ways, and I don't see that as being the American journey. I'm not particularly worried for the survival of American democracy, at least not in the short to medium term. I do, however, have a problem. Ultimately, with how difficult it is, like many people do, to make the US Constitution adapt to changing circumstances. I mean, we're now in a picture demographically where 16% of America can get a 51 Senate vote and pass bills, confirm justices to the Supreme Court, representing just 16% of Americans. So, one senator per 200,000 South Dakotans is worth one senator for 18 million Californians. And the Constitution cannot adapt to that. And you need 3/4 of states, hypothetically, to amend the Constitution. But, they're not going to be turkeys voting for Thanksgiving, right? They're going to keep the system. It gives them outsized power. And so I do fear that the flexibility you would like to see in the American Constitution isn't there, and it is brittle, therefore. And that the gap between small states and populous states, between cities and hinterlands, is getting wider and wider, and politics is not accommodating that. And so that is a longer-term worry about the Constitution and about American democracy. It's not an imminent one, but it's a very, very persistent structural concern.
That is an important one. And Jan, just an hour ago, I recorded this week's We the People podcast about the Gill partisan gerrymandering case that the court heard on Tuesday, which some have considered the most important partisan gerrymandering case of the decade. And the question there is, in Wisconsin, if the Republican Party can get a minority of votes, 48%, but win a majority of seats, 60%, is that a violation of the First Amendment rights of expression and association and the Equal Protection Clause's guarantee of political equality? Is this problem that the court is considering and that Ed has identified of small minorities of the population being able to elect leaders a populist threat? And are other countries that are experiencing populism also electing their leaders by small minorities?
Well, they certainly are changing their systems to make sure that they stay in power as long as possible. I think maybe it's worth underlining that while this expression in liberal democracy has become very popular, it maybe sort of makes us not see what's really going on. I'm not denying there's a difference between liberalism and democracy. I'm not saying they're the same thing. But if these rulers tamper with rights which are essential for democracy, free speech, free assembly, and votes sort of counting roughly in the same way, then they're not just attacking liberalism, they're attacking democracy itself. And if we rest content with a liberal democracy, sort of one side effect is that many of these actors are going to say, actually, you know what, I don't want to be a liberal anyway. I mean, Viktor Orban in Hungary has said it very clearly, because for them, liberalism is sort of relativism, permissiveness, globalization, neoliberalism, if in doubt. But they're very keen that they retain democracy. Ed has mentioned that there's been this sort of global recession of democracies. But the word remains very important. I mean, autocrats keep spending a lot of money to lobby to make sure that they are recognized as democracies in the relevant international fora. So many of them are actually going to be quite happy to be called illiberal Democrats, as long as nobody questions that they are still sort of Democrats. So I think we should try to be more precise and basically say it's not just liberalism that suffers in these situations, partly because also in the US it seems such a partisan term. It's democracy itself that is being damaged, that is being under threat, or maybe outright abolished in the end.
Just a quick follow-up to this crucial point. You're telling us that populism is not consistent with democracy. In fact, at times it can threaten it. So were the founders in Madison wrong when they adopted the classical models that said that monarchy could lead to tyranny and aristocracy to oligarchy and democracy to the mob? Might in fact the mob or minority factions threaten democracy rather than reinforcing it?
There's a wide range of what democracies can look like. And certainly that is one way of, so to speak, doing it. That is, in a sense, one way of looking out for a particular scenario. I would just simply, again, underline that populism is not really about sort of the people out there really rising up. It takes elite actors to make use of certain people. In the end, of course, I mean, again, at the risk of reminding you of the obvious, the winning candidate didn't get, the mob behind him, the majority. He didn't even get the majority. So in that sense, again, we should, I think, be less inclined to just blame the people because they're so ill-informed and they're driven by passions and so on. Of course, these were some of the sentiments of the founders that has become a little bit the default option of liberal observers today. But precisely if we simply end up blaming the people, we don't see these more structural issues, such as gerrymandering, such as fragmented public spheres. I mean, polarization is not just some natural phenomenon, it's also big business in a certain way. And again, I think we should focus more on the elite actors who are behind these things than saying, oh, it's a minority of ill-educated mob sort of passion-driven citizens.
I can barely resist asking more on this beat, but there's so many good questions that I need to start asking them instead of mine. So the first mark is, how does a populist leader keep control if he or she doesn't deliver for the base?
By becoming more and more of a tyrant, basically. Controlling the media, controlling the message, convincing people that he or she is delivering when he's not. That's the real risk. Oligarchy becomes tyranny, becomes, eventually people figure it out, but in the short term it can be very effective.
Ed, how should an anti-populist election pitch be framed? If not, don't vote against your own interest.
It's got to make a positive case, the kind of case that I know Hillary Clinton thinks she made, but didn't really drive the message home very well. You've got to make a positive vision. And only 9% of it, studies have been done on this, only 9% of Hillary's ads were about jobs or the economy. Trump, it was about a third of his ads. So she was basically saying Trump's a ghastly person and that's why I should be president. And that is not enough.
Jan, a historical question. How do you compare current populists and populism in America in the 1800s and 1900s?
So again, I wouldn't see sort of obvious similarities. I would actually more point at episodes like George Wallace. I think that's much more the pattern that we might be seeing now, with all the undertones of, to put it politely, culture war, to put it less politely, de facto appeals to racism, and so on. Again, important as a footnote, the point that Ed made at the beginning. We know how populist leaders talk, and we should hold them accountable for that. We can't conclude from the way they talk that everybody who supports them entirely shares that view. I mean, this is the deplorables trap, but it's also very typical in Europe that one simply assumes, oh, these must all be anti-democrats or anti-pluralists and so on. In many cases, I mean, we can't simply know that. And it's very presumptuous to simply say, oh, you must entirely have a certain view. At least in theory, it's thinkable that somebody, for instance, says, when Marine Le Pen in France says that all the other parties are corrupt and so on, I don't actually think that. But she has a fantastic agricultural policy. And as a farmer in a particular region of France, that's really why I'm voting for her. So at least we should sort of leave open that possibility, as opposed to making these large generalizations about people where we simply can't know it.
Two powerful questions about the white working class. So how does one address the malaise of the white working class in a more constructive way, especially not to feed into their misogyny and racism is the question. Ed, you talk about that in your book.
Yeah, I mean, this was sort of one of the ideas that, I think Hillary could have pushed more strongly, which is kind of a Marshall Plan for the middle classes, that people are rightly, understandably terrified about the future of work. And the present of work, that people feel that what they had a generation ago of loyal employers, and they were loyal employees who invested in their skills and training, and an education system that better served the kinds of skills they needed at work. That's really, if not vanished, it's receded greatly. And we need a new sort of cradle-to-grave system of training, and it can be public, private, it doesn't matter what the form is necessarily. It matters that people feel they are being invested in to cope with the future of work. I think that is a positive agenda. I think it speaks very directly to people's anxieties. And I think, we all panicked a bit about Germany the other day because almost 1 in 7 voted for hard right parties, but actually that was the lowest populist vote anywhere in the West since Brexit. It was a relatively good result. It's just because it was Germany. Germany has something to teach us about not confusing being a graduate with being skilled, and not confusing somebody who hasn't gone to college with being unskilled. And I think there's a big role for vocational education and for reimagining how we equip people for the workforce of the future. And Germany's got a lot of lessons there to teach us.
Mark, if liberals should not view blue-collar conservatives as being oblivious to their own best economic interests, how should blue-collar conservatives be viewed?
Blue-collar conservatives? I just think about blue-collar, I think the problem with Democrats and progressives in connecting with these voters is we are too hung up on various policy initiatives which we may not understand and they clearly don't understand. And we need to find a way to directly identify with them. I mean, certainly calling them deplorable is not a good place to start. And I think that, Democratic Party and we are the pluralist in the American political constellation. But for some reason, we can identify all sorts of underprivileged groups in this country, but we don't view white-collar workers who have seen tremendous economic downturn for themselves in the last 30 years. We don't see them as somebody that we need to do something about. And until they believe we do, and there are all sorts of ways in terms of communicating that message that would work better than simply talking about different policy ideas, many of which I agree with. I think you're on the right track on all of these ideas. But in the first instance, we need to be able to talk to these people in a way that they believe we care about them. I don't think they believe that now. And until that changes, even the best policies are not going to change this dynamic.
Last question and then closing statements. Isn't populism merely isolationism in a different word, meaning who cares about the rest of the world, what about us? Jan.
Well, it's certainly in many contexts, when we talk about right-wing populism, comes out de facto as nationalism, as America first, whoever else it is first. But they're still, I think, not quite the same thing, because, at least in my view, populism really is about saying we and only we represent the people. And nationalism can come out in different ways. You can be a nationalist without making that particular claim. So I maybe also would underline that, because we've been looking at these recent elections and there's been a bit of a sigh of relief, and some newspapers have even said we might already be living in the post-populist moment. But there's a difference between that anti-pluralism and then specific policy content, which might lead to situations where sort of our official populist, let's say Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, doesn't do as well as expected. But if at the same time, our supposedly mainstream, very responsible Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte puts ads in all Dutch newspapers where he says, act normally or leave the country.
Right.
This is after his party's, Liberal Party's slogan in the 80s was, be who you are. You kind of realize, okay, it's not as simple, win or lose, because officially they can use, but if the other parties adopt their content, if they get into the business of copying, well, in a certain way, they're still winning. So I think we have to get away from looking at every election as just a matter of up or down, because there might be more stuff going on.
So the closing statement question is the question of the Madisonian Commission, namely, if you could propose a single structural or constitutional or technological change to restore values of the rule of law and constitutionalism and resist populist forces, what would they be? We've talked about things ranging from the segmented media landscape to partisan gerrymandering to low voter turnout. If you had to pick a single reform, what would it be? Ed?
I'm not sure whether it would qualify as a constitutional reform, but the fairness doctrine, the defense of the public square and of media that at least attempts to be objective, is desperately needed. As Jan and Mark have both pointed out, there is no public square anymore. And these separate sort of places that people, echo chambers, are not even linked by alleyways. There are separate conversations going on, partly technological, partly because trust has just collapsed in modern society. And I think the public square, the missing public square, has to be addressed. I can't tell you what particular remedies would get us there, but Facebook and Google and others have to be part of the solution here. They cannot go on essentially ripping off all kinds of professional news gathering. You're probably beginning to see a very self-interested angle on this point as a newspaper journalist, but I mean it in bigger principle terms. We need a public square.
Mark, a single reform to resist populism and resurrect constitutionalism and the rule of law.
I grew up under Sam Ervin, who's my first boss, and I'd never have seen an amendment to the Constitution in the modern era that I would have supported. So I don't want to see the Constitution changed. I want to see the Constitution made to work. And I see this as mainly a problem of statesmanship and political leadership. And until we address these underlying political forces, we can't make the system work. And that's why I see it as essentially a political problem, not an institutional problem, as long as the institutions are doing fairly well, as you point out. The media, the courts, the politics has failed.
Jan, last word to you.
So 2, if I may.
Please, that would be great.
So first of all, maybe not surprisingly, in this country, campaign finance reform. And secondly, I would strengthen the point that Ed was making. If I remember correctly, you have Carl Sandstein coming to talk here in a while. So he's put forward some ideas about how perhaps we get out of these echo chambers on the internet, how some technological change could allow us to sort of hear the other side at the same time. I think that's absolutely crucial in all kinds of ways. I think none of us has conclusive answers at this point, but this is the thing that we have to think about.
For casting light on this complicated, crucial, and urgent problem of democracy, please join me in thanking our guests.
Thank you. So, I have a slight